So we are recording, but if at any time you have questions or I've said things that are unclear, please feel free to unmute yourself and join the conversation. That is fine. I don't mind interruptions at all. So I encourage you to do that. So if I can do the sharing right, then I think we're going to be good. Okay, let me hang on just a minute, admitting some folks here, and I'll get going. All right, again, it's great to see so many people part of this this conversation. Well, let me try this again. All right. I think it's working for me, but just to make sure it's also working for you, on someone who is part of this conversation, could you just unmute and just offer me the assurance that you're seeing something on your screen right now that looks like it's a title slide? Are we doing all right there? All right, thanks Atticus for the thumbs up. So yeah, this is about England and the brutality of the slave trade, certainly about the Americas as well, and how they're linked up with this this part of our past. But we will be focused on England's kind of its economic interest in what happened in the 18th century and early parts of the 19th century. Also happened a good bit before that too, but really gets going in earnest around then. I want to start by thanking the Martin Luther King Jr. Committee, and that includes our terrific students, colleagues on the Concerned Black Students, and also the Faculty Diversity Advisory Committee for putting together just a great week. A week that certainly started with our observance and everyone moving in on the beginning on Monday of Martin Luther King Day. But our convocation speaker was just terrific too. And it was a good week to have an inauguration poem that pays homage to our past and our present. If you haven't heard that poem, I feel like me as an English professor, I have to tip my hat to it and encourage you to go see what's all involved there. But I want to start by offering a couple of pictures of, let's see, yeah, here we go. Statues of Abraham Lincoln. They're exactly the same, actually. These are one is a replica of the other. One of them is in Cincinnati, and it was actually the Taft family that commissioned this, put it and had it made. And this is at the Taft Museum of Art in Cincinnati. And then the other one was to go to England. And I remember teaching abroad, actually, and coming down the street and seeing a statue of Abraham Lincoln in England. And that raised questions for me. You know, we don't have too many statues of Churchill in the United States, but here is Abraham Lincoln. What's behind that? Well, as it turns out, Manchester was linked to the South in an important way. Manchester was a manufacturing center. In fact, in the middle of the 19th century, this is where Karl Marx is going, because he sees factories there and he's kind of interested in what the new form of labor is going to be like, what's it going to do to our society. So Manchester was the place to go. Manchester produced textiles. And this is kind of the beginning of a global economy here. If you were going to make textiles, well, your raw materials were likely going to come from the American South. Because cotton was grown there. Cotton benefited from slave labor and it was cheap. So they were benefiting from slavery. Cotton was being brought over to Manchester where it could it could make textiles out of the raw materials, and then actually even sell it back to the United States where it came from. So Manchester is, even though it's distant from the American South and the plantations, it's actually all tied up in that. And I have to offer my apologies here. I think I saw someone with a hand up, and because I probably can, but I'm not sure how to have all my participants lists up and everything. If you could just unmute if you have a question, interrupt me, that's great. So I'll pause a little bit if there are questions or observations. Okay. All right. But please do interrupt me if anything comes up here. So that statue of Lincoln in Manchester, England, where they're making textiles, was a symbol of the solidarity between the working classes of England and the African people who were enslaved in the South. And this was at a hard time for them because actually, I think that is CJ. CJ, if you have a question, please just unmute, and I think you can do that. Okay, I'm gonna keep forging ahead on it. So they had this, the solidarity with the African labor in the South because they were hardworking people in the factories, and it could have easily gone another way. This was hard on Manchester. As soon as the Civil War started, Lincoln was actually the one who initiated a blockade that didn't allow the cotton to come to England because they were trying to reduce the financial resources in the South. And more than half of the people who were employed in the factories were out of work actually during the Civil War. So it was a real statement of the solidarity of the working classes with those enslaved people half a world away, to show that they backed their freedom. Now, why this is also, I think, interesting for what I'd like to address in England is that the real history is more complicated than that. There were cotton riots. There were actually factories that had a Confederate flag that was flying over the top of it. So everybody wasn't on board. And you can imagine if your unemployment rate is over 50%, at least of the factory laborers, things are going to be hard on you. But England, like any country, likes those narratives that promotes its story of liberty. And this is true as we go back in time as well. There's kind of the story we like to believe about ourselves, and then the underlying story that maybe we have to reckon with as we just integrate our past. Well, let's go back to when the slave trade is actually active. As we had the Civil War, England really isn't involved in, there is no slave trade anymore. They've already cut off its vessels from participating in that part of the American economy. But if we go back to 1772, there was this really interesting case called the Mansfield Decision, or the Somerset case, where there's a man from Boston who bought an African man as a slave. So the man who purchased it, his name was Charles Stewart. Again, this is in 1769, so there's no American citizens here. He serves the British colony. And the man who was enslaved, his name, James Somerset. Well, at some point actually around 1771, Charles Stewart decides he's going to go back to England, and he brings James Somerset with him. Well, James Somerset decides, if I'm in England, I'm no longer enslaved, and so makes the case that he shouldn't be anymore in the ownership because English laws don't have people treated as property. So it goes to the court case. What do you do with someone who is enslaved in another country, but then brought back to England? And England is very just excited or loves this story of Lord Mansfield's decision, because and why wouldn't you be with a verdict like this, where he said, the air of England is too pure for any slave to breathe. Well, he was pointing to the fact there are no laws in England that treat a human being as property. And you can hear that, just that level of kind of patriotism in there, that England does not stoop to this kind of thing. So so James Somerset went free. And And England goes about its business of believing that it is the beacon of freedom in the world. Well, it's more complicated than that, because England is also involved in the slave trade in a big way. So they may not be allowing people to be enslaved or occupy that kind of legal position or lack of position in the homeland, but they are tied up in products. Their vessels are helping this economy move, and they are benefiting from the profits that come from the trade. So this is how the transatlantic slave trade would work for England, and how they could make a decision that would say, we really don't have slaves here, but yet they're part of a world where they are a direct beneficiary from that kind of economy, that kind of inhumanity to others. So there's kind of a rough triangle that happens here. England has and always been a maritime powerhouse. It kind of comes from being a nation that's practically an island. There's a lot of ships there, and they've done well in trade. Well, those ships would leave an English harbor, and during the slave trade would go down to that what's called the Gold Coast, or the Slave Coast. And with the goods that they would bring from England, they would purchase people to be sold as slaves in North America. So they fill up their cargo with human beings and go over to the West Indies, and they would tend to drop them the people they had on board in the West Indies. And this is where they would be. I don't know much about this, but they speak about the slaves being broken in, and you can see where there's another arrow that picks up slaves and drops them off in Charleston, South Carolina. So there would be a kind of stop off point. The English vessels would go to the West Indies and perhaps not go on to Charleston, other vessels from there. But they would pick up things like sugar. England loves its sugar, and molasses. Other items would go back to England. And so this ship is going on a triangle, and it's never empty. It's making profits everywhere it goes. When it arrives in England, it's selling products that people want, and it's also bringing back money and supporting the economy there. So the air may be too pure to be breathed by slaves or people who are enslaved, but the economy there is certainly getting a big shot in the arm from being involved in what's happening on America's coast. So here's just some facts about England's participation in it. How far does it go back? Really far. So 1562 is the first the first slave vessel that historians know about, and that is a whole long time ago. That is 2 years before Shakespeare is even born. Elizabeth's not on the throne yet in England. And there's already been some participation in the slave trade, but it's not the same thing as what it would become. It would eventually explode, and that is partly as a result of the plantations. And the plantations mark a shift that happens. There's in this early phase, there was labor in Barbados and in other parts of the colonies that where people from Africa were kind of alongside convicts, people who had been charged and convicted of crimes. Part of their sentence could be to do this labor. But as the demand grows, as the demand for sugar grows, laws start to develop that distinguish the white people from the black people. So here's where you're getting that codification of black people as property. And that sets into motion another kind of economy. So between 1640 and 1807, the slave trade is escalating, and the plantation economies are growing in the West Indies and in North America. People are finding ways of making even more money. And keep in mind, this whole time, England is able to tell itself that it does not participate in slavery. The English air is too pure. In the process, there are 3 ports in England that kind of emerge as the center of the slave trade. And actually, as the slave trade starts being more regulated, because England does become aware of its complicity in the inhumanity here, one of the moves it makes to try and reduce its participation is to limit itself to just 3 of those port cities, and those were Bristol, Liverpool, and London. By the time it was all over, by the time the slave trade was discontinued, England and Portugal, and you can see those are 2 countries that would have an interest just by their geographic location in having lots of ships. They made up 70% of the slave trade. And though in terms of numbers, England transported 3.1 million African people. 2.7 million arrived. And that's a euphemism for 400,000 people who died, who were killed in the process. And it's so easy, particularly for me, as someone who's drawn to English. I'm not a numbers person, where the numbers can just start blurring a little bit. But if I think about how many people are in the city I live in, how many people in Springfield? Well, we've got about 60,000 people. Well, if you multiply that by 7 or 8, you're getting to that point where you know about how many people died, how many people were whose lives were cast aside here. And that's just England. That's not the whole slave trade, but that's just England's involvement. So there's a whole lot of inhumanity that's happening here without England necessarily feeling that it's complicit. It's making its Mansfield decisions on its own land. These other things are happening in the broader world. It will come to an end, does come to an end in 1807, where England says, okay, we are going to abolish the slave trade. So that happens after a number of efforts. And that might lead us to the question of, well, what is it that makes for cultural change? When do you have, because this has been going on clearly for centuries, or a century and a half or about. What was it that created the conditions where, even though it's not humanity that's near at hand, it's something that needed ultimately to be dealt with? I want to spend just a few moments on the kinds of things that happened towards the end of the 19th century that would recognize a shift, because the Civil War in the United States is coming later. The consciousness raising and its involvement in slavery is different here. But in England, it took till 1807. And then later, the 1833 is when it's actually outlawed in all the British colonies too. I'll be focused more on the slave trade. There were some what you would call kind of cultural flashpoints, where those things that are conveniently distant, conveniently out of mind, suddenly hit the newspapers. And you read stories where you learn about the kind of atrocities that may be happening under your watch. So one of those is a slave ship called the Zong. Now, I have just kind of a picture here for your edification. That is a painting by a British artist, J.M.W. Turner, called The Slave Ship. It is not necessarily a representation of the Zong story that we'll share. I think he was just more generally referring to the violence, inhumanity that's there. And this is after England's out of the slave trade, but it's a dramatic painting, and you can see his the way he's kind of shown in a suggestive way rather than in a directly representational way, the violence, the death that's going on in the water as a ship struggles in its in inclement weather. So there was, in 1781, this ship called the Zong, unusual word. The Zong is a slave ship that leaves Liverpool, one of those ports. And as it kind of, we saw the triangle, as it goes to the Gold Coast in Africa, it will bring its items that it can trade there. And it's going to pick up 254 African people there to take them over to the West Indies and then make its trade and get its profits from that point. Because as we saw in the laws that are changing, as we move to a plantation economy, people are now being codified as property. Well, there are ways that you assure that you're in business, that you can protect that property, and people bound for slavery were no exception to that rule. So The ship, as it's leaving, or as it picks up it's 254 people, it is insured for 8,000 pounds. That's a lot of money in England in the 18th century. One of the poets I study, he had, in a particularly good year, he made 100 pounds, and he was able to have a servant in that year. He wasn't extravagant, but he had someone who could do some housework for him and live on that amount of money. And in terms of the market value, that ship full of 244 African people would have sold for about twice that. When it arrived in Jamaica in the West Indies, where they do the kind of preparation of these people for market in Charleston and other places, the owners made a claim for the loss of 130 people. So it was insured, and then when it arrived, it said, we need to make a claim on our insurance because we lost 130 people. Well, what we learned was those people were thrown overboard. Why were they thrown overboard? Because the ship was low on water and other supplies. Why was it low on water and other supplies? Because they had made navigation mistakes. So this is just a gut-wrenching story where we've gone from human beings who were treated as perhaps less worthy of value and working alongside convicts who were, treated as less worthy of value. And so there was punishment in the kind of labor that they were doing, to then creating laws that treat people as property, to now events that clearly don't make a distinction between someone as a human being and kind of cargo that could be jettisoned for the benefit of someone else's I guess survival, perhaps in this case, but comfort. So their conditions were not weighed here. So that becomes, when that story comes back and it goes through the courts, just as you would imagine, when insurance companies are involved, someone wants to make a claim, insurance companies don't want to pay that claim. And so the argument actually goes back and forth. And the first decision on the Zong case actually decided in favor of the owners of the Zong. Said they should be paid for even though they were jettisoned, they were thrown overboard, they should be paid. And that was appealed, and there was a reverse decision. But it was a cultural flashpoint because business decisions being what they are, you can work that out in the court. The public was appalled by what happened. So I want to go back to the name of the ship, because actually the name Zong is Dutch for care. If that's not irony, I don't know what is. And some of you may know too, there was a famous slave trading vessel called the Jesus. There were African people who were brought to our side of the globe on a vessel that was called the Jesus. Well, this is maybe not quite as ironic as that, but pretty close. So that leads to change. That leads to, and we're still a ways off from ending the slave trade. This is 1781, 1807 is when the slave trade will end. But England had these moments in its past where it could no longer tell itself it was all about liberty. Its ships were treating human beings this way. Its desire for sugar was connected to what was happening to these human beings. So that story is going to keep coming up. It's not the same thing. But you can imagine someone looking at our own period and saying, well, what happened with George Floyd? Well, it wasn't new. And it was perhaps something that people knew was happening on some level of their consciousness. But when it hit the papers and when the video hit social media, things that are in the back of your mind run to the front of your mind. And now we feel, many of us feel an urgency to act. Well, the Zong was one of those things. That could be referred to again and again. There's also that need for conscientious politicians to do the good work. And England had one in William Wilberforce. If you're familiar with Wilberforce University, not far from here, named after the strong legislative advocate for the end of slavery and the end of the slave trade. And he works for many years trying to get this done. He himself, it was in the Anglican tradition. This is important because you can't actually or you can now, but you couldn't at the time occupy a place in government if you weren't part of the Anglican Church. but he was friends with a lot of Quakers. And Quakers, particularly in English history, deserve a lot of attention, a lot of credit for being part of the abolition movement. So he was kind of the voice of the Quakers inside government. They were giving him the information that he would then take to the other legislators and try and be this advocate for change. It did not come quickly again. So 1789 is the first time he introduces it, and he's going to introduce this proposal 11 more times, and it just lands on some deaf ears. And part of that is all of the industry that's connected with the slave trade. So the inhumanity may be abundantly clear, but the people who build ships don't want to see this part of the trade. And the people who are sailors don't want to see this trade in their jobs. And the people who are in the insurance industry perhaps don't, or are lobbying not to see an end to the thing that has served them well. So when it gets up to making decisions in government, even if there is some popular interest in it, money has always spoken with a clear voice, and Wilberforce came up against that, but did ultimately succeed. Wilberforce was friends, as well as many other Quakers, with Thomas Clarkson, who was in England, became a big advocate for the ending of the slave trade, and his voice was one of the researcher. He was the person who would try and get to know the sailors or get on board the vessels themselves. And he started producing these documents. He's got a couple of them, but the one that gets the most attention is an essay on the slavery and commerce of the human species, published in 1786, that did the kind of journalistic work of reporting back to England what the slave trade really looks like. What are the nuts and bolts of this? And so you have images like this that were reaching more people in England, where you can, just like what I was saying about, what does it mean for 400,000 people to have died? It feels abstract. He provided images like the one that we're looking at here that made the slave trade something less than abstract, that forced us to imagine what it would be like to be under the hold of a ship like this with that many people. I mentioned the Zong had 244 people. Again, that feels like a number to me, unless I can kind of scheme it out like this, and then put myself into that experience. So he published this work in 1786 and continued to do kind of that consciousness raising labor, and along with Wilberforce and the Quakers and the abolition societies that he was working with, helped turn public opinion. And he kept working until 1807 as well. And then there are the voices of the people who were enslaved themselves. This is Olaudah Equiano, who published his Equianos Travels, and which was an account of his education, his slavery, the different experiences that he had at various points along the way. There were others of these stories that give the British public this sense of the culture that was lost when they were taken from Africa, the kinds of inhumanity they dealt with when they were under slavery, and the lives that they were capable of after they left slavery. And Equiano's publication is kind of a sad one. It's not a unique thing at all, but when it was published, it had to deal with members of the English public not believing that a Black man could write like that. And so subsequent editions had to have testimonials from white people who said, I know Olaudah Equiano. I can testify to his skills. So England may not have had slavery, but they certainly had racism and forms of white supremacy as well. But these and other stories from the people who lived the experience of slavery helped those people in England whose benefits come from having cheap goods and living in a thriving economy and not being able to see what was supporting all that. They were able to kind of get this other perspective on slavery. And then there was this tradition. This is really how I came into the subject. There were poets and novelists, essayists who were, if not part of the abolition societies themselves, their conscience was moved by what they saw going on. And they were addressing what we might call an empathy gap, which we always deal with as human beings. We feel for some people and not for others. And that was the issue here. It's clear what the injustice was, but as far as the depth of feeling that might arise from that injustice, it perhaps needed to be bolstered. It needed to be informed. It needed to be given a kind of expression that would elicit an emotional response. And so here's one of it. It's actually not the whole poem. The poem's a little bit longer. And I'm thinking the best way to go with this one, it's a brutal poem, is just to offer some silence and a chance for folks to read it. And I do want to offer kind of a trigger warning on it. It's a difficult piece to read because there's a lot of inhumanity here, a lot of brutality, at the same time as there is a cavalier tone, an absence of care in the voice that's offering it. So the context here that readers might get from the title itself is that this is a slave trader in the dumps. Well, what's the slave trader sad about? Well, in 1788, the efforts to end the slave trade were getting started. And so he may be thinking about, well, how am I going to make my living? And perhaps trying to anticipating, and in this case, wrongly anticipating that the slave trade will end. It's going to continue for another decade here. He thinks maybe the thing to do is to try and sell some of the devices that he has. Things that are used to subjugate other people. So I'm just going to leave a little bit of silence here and allow you to read it, and you'll catch the refrain of "for he's a jolly good fellow." And so if you want to, when you break into that, which nobody can deny, if you want to put that melody in your head, it seems like this poet William Cooper is inviting us to do that and to feel the disjunction when we hear that that refrain following on who this person is and what this person's trying to accomplish. So let me just be quiet for just for a couple minutes. Go ahead and take this poem in, and if you have a response you'd like to share, I'm sure there would be a number of us who'd be grateful to hear you kind of process this with us. Maybe that's given us enough time to just feel the direction of this poem and where it might be headed. And it does seem like this was one of those threads in British society in the end of the 18th century that we can point to and say, this is going to get us to 1807 eventually. But are there any thoughts or reactions that you'd like to share about what writers were trying to do to be part of the solution? And please, uh, uh, if you do have something, just go ahead and unmute and feel free to share. Oops. Okay, I'm just going to go on to just really kind of wrap this up with one thought, and invite maybe our own conversation about how this might point to a future for us and for what England has done. So if living in the midst of the slave trade is full of disavowal, perhaps enjoying the products that you benefit from, enjoying the price that you pay for it, without having to look into the labor that went into the making or why it was so cheap. And how do we reckon with that looking back? How does that become part of our story? And England is very good at museums. And so this has been one way in which they've responded to it. If you go to Liverpool now, you'll certainly find a Beatles museum. That's probably what the Liverpool is most known for. But it is a port city, and there's a maritime museum there. And there's the International Slavery Museum there, that is just focused on that past and telling that story. Bringing that forward in a way that that can be woven through the national narrative about who they have been and who they would like to be in the future. And I know we also have calls to do this in our own country with our own participation in the history of slavery, and what that might look like. One of the developments in our defense spending just over the last year has been to change the name of some buildings, to cease funding unless names of buildings were changed, because we do seem to be asking questions about how do you address history when we know these things were true, and we know the impulse to not tell that history. We know the impulse to say that's all past, and not see the ways that we're still standing on the economic disparity that this created, and still standing on the lack of caring relationship between people in our economy, which is such an easy thing to do. As soon as products turn into something you pay a price for, they lose their human connection. That was one of Karl Marx's insights. He called it commodity fetishism, because we just turned the product into a thing, and it stops being a human relationship. So if you're just buying cotton, if you're just buying the textiles that were made from that cotton, and you're not seeing a relationship, then there are kinds of inhumanity that can result from that. And these museums and different ways of looking at our own history might be an opportunity to have an intervention to establish a different kind of connection. And other than that, I just have a slide that shows that, yeah, I'm not a historian, and I just have some good sources where you can go and find out more about that. So there's a bit about the Manchester history there, and a bit about the National Archives from England's perspective on the transatlantic slave trade, and more about slavery and England's involvement in that slave trade can be had at those links. And I can share other sources with you too if you're interested. But I think then what the best thing to do is to go ahead and, all right, I think I have stopped sharing. Yeah. All right. And I'd be eager for any thoughts, any ideas, either about what this might tell us about our relationship to the past, or I think England's history in the slave trade is kind of a universal story about the way that we do treat products as just things, and we don't see the human relationships, or at least I'm not. I'll just speak for myself. I'm not as prone to see the human relationships that lie behind the products that I purchase. So that's part of England's story in slavery. Any thoughts, ideas that come to your mind? I will just say, I'm terrible at keeping silence here, but and allowing folks to come in. But I am grateful that we have this many people coming to this presentation. It's been terrific. So thank you for taking time to hear someone who does English try and take a hack at the English slave trade.
Hey, Rick.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Certainly. Thank you for coming.
Dr. Incorvati,
Yeah.
just one interesting thing. Thank you for that presentation. Just one interesting thing I'd like to add also, that William Cowper, whom you mentioned in your presentation, also had a close association with John Newton. William Cowper was also a famous, he wrote hymns as well as poems, and he had a close association with John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, who John Newton, many people might know, was also had that epiphany writing Amazing Grace after he had an epiphany and wanted to turn around from slave trading. So there's a close association there as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mr. Brooks. I appreciate that. And yeah, I left John Newton out, and John Newton could very much be a part of the English story on the slave trade. And Cowper or Cooper, they pronounce it different ways. He was something of a big poet, but when the slave trade came along, his drive just picked up. This became a whole part of his career, and he kind of led other writers who were finding ways of expressing their moral outrage in poetry for him, but in other forms as well. So the slave trade brought fire to his conscience, and his work changed. All right.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. All right. I think I can safely stop recording here, and just thanks to everyone.